So, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I was a little worried. I'm happy to see so many people here because I was worried that after 2 Bollywood sessions, there'd be a mass exodus for a talk about the molecular biology of aging. But anyway, I'd like to talk to you about some themes from a recent book I've written called Why We Die. And of course, why we die has been a perennial question ever since humans realized that we were mortal. For example, I don't think any other species is aware of its mortality. Other animals may know about death, but they don't know that you have an expiration date, that you have a fixed lifespan, and that everyone is going to die at some particular point, by some particular point. So humans really are unique, and it has driven human culture and religion, as well as science, through the ages, to try and understand what it is that we mean by dying. Now, death is also a very peculiar thing. As you sit here, during my talk, millions of your cells are going to be dying, and you don't even notice them. And in fact, many of those cells need to die for you to keep going. On the other hand, at the moment of your death, most of your cells are still alive. That's why you can donate your organs to other people. And so what do we mean by dying? Well, what we mean is the loss of our ability to function as a whole individual. And that's really the kind of death we're talking about. I'm not talking about accidental deaths or being killed or dying of infection or anything like that. I'm talking about the death that's inevitable as a result of aging. So if you look at that kind of death, what you realize is that lifespan among species varies enormously. But it doesn't mean that each species is programmed to die after a certain time, by which I mean evolution doesn't select for genes that make you die. Rather, it selects for genes that give you advantages early in life, but those same genes cause you problems later in life. But by that time, you've already reproduced and passed on your genes, so evolution doesn't care about that. It doesn't care how long you live, it only cares about whether you can pass on your genes successfully. And just to give you a variation, at one extreme you have a mayfly, which only lives for about a day. And then at the other extreme you have things like the Greenland shark, which lived for 400 years. You might even have a Galapagos tortoise wandering around today that encountered Darwin 150 years ago. So that's an amazing thing to ponder. So the question is, what is the natural limit to our own species? And we know that life expectancy has increased over the last 150 years. We used to, on average, live less than 40 years, and now we live in many countries over 80 years. So it's more than doubled. But if you look at the maximum lifespan, that hasn't actually changed that much. For example, Michelangelo was almost 90 when he died, and he died in the 1500s. So what's the limit for humans? Well, this is the record holder that we know of, Jeanne Calment. She lived to be 122 years old, and as you can see in this picture, she had a cigarette and a glass of port every day after lunch. And I wouldn't recommend that to anybody, but I would say that she also had 2.5 pounds. That's about 1 kilo of chocolate a week, and I think I could get behind that. Anyway, but nobody else, since she died, has lived past 120. And she died about 30 years ago. And so what people believe is that our species has evolved, so the limit of our natural lifespan is about 110 to 120 years old. And that's how much the very oldest humans live. And of course, most of us don't get anywhere near that. Now, it turns out the number of centenarians, that is, people who live to be over 100, is actually growing. And this is because more and more people are reaching about 80, and enough of them survive, so there are more survivors. But the number of people living past 110 is not growing. And that suggests a more of a hard limit to our natural biology. But just because there's a hard limit to our natural biology doesn't mean that we won't be able to change our natural biology. If we were able to slow down aging, then we might be able to breach that limit. But I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think what's more likely is that we'll find ways to age more healthily as we get older. Now, the question is, what is aging? Well, aging, it turns out, is broadly defined as the accumulation of changes and damage to our entire system that increases dysfunction over time. So it results in loss of function over time. Eventually, what happens is the loss of function becomes critical. It affects a system like the heart or the brain, and then the entire body cannot function as a unit, and that's when we die. And there are many ways in which this damage occurs. It occurs all the way from the molecules in our cells, such as our DNA here, or the telomeres, which are the ends of our chromosomes, or changes to our DNA, or the proteins that are encoded by the DNA. Those also get damaged. And then organelles in our cells called mitochondria, which are responsible for energy production, get damaged. And you get cells that also become dysfunctional and go into a state called senescence, where they secrete inflammatory compounds. And then cells that generate other cells, including generate tissue. We all know, for example, if you cut your skin, it regenerates. Your hair regenerates, well, at least in some of us. So you know that cells in us are constantly regenerating, and it's the stem cells that are responsible for regenerating these tissues. And stem cells themselves decline with age, and that means your ability to regenerate tissue and replenish yourself also declines. And then you have cell-cell communication, for example, the immune system and other networks of cells that make us function. Those all break down. The point I'm trying to make is aging occurs at every level of complexity, from the very simple molecules to the proteins in our cells, to the cells, to the tissues, and the entire organism. Now, why is there so much interest in aging? Well, one reason is that in many countries, the fraction of older people is increasing. And in fact, this is a combination of the fact that many people are living longer, people are on average living longer, but also fertility rates in most countries is going down. In fact, in many developed countries, it's well below replacement rate, including in East Asian countries. In India, I should say it's just about replacement rate, but that's almost entirely due to 5 states. If you remove those 5 states, India would be below replacement rate. And in fact, the south of India is already below replacement rate. So this means that we need to worry about societies with a growing population that's over 60. And so there's a real imperative to make sure that this aging population is healthy and preferably independent and productive, so that they can really stay as contributing members of society for as long as possible. And so that's a big incentive behind a lot of aging research. But what it meant is that there's a huge explosion. There's money from governments and charities, but there's a lot of private money. Now, the private money, I'm a bit cynical, but it's because my generation, which is the baby boomers, are reaching that old age, and they don't like it. And so they want quick fixes. And so a lot of them are funding, some of them are billionaires, and they're funding a lot of this aging research. And so this means that there have been about 300,000 papers published in just the last 10 years, and a proliferation of journals just devoted to aging. And 700 startups with many billions of dollars invested in anti-aging research. And this has also led to some solid science, but also some quite dubious claims. You know, we can have a discussion when we chat about some of these claims. But nevertheless, there are some promising approaches. One of them is based on the idea that caloric restriction in many species have resulted in those animals aging more healthily and resembling younger animals. And so people have found out what are some of the pathways, the biochemical and cellular pathways that are affected by caloric restriction. This is when you reduce the number of calories you take in quite dramatically. But there are drugs that inhibit those same pathways. So these are called mimics of caloric restriction. And some of those are promising candidates for anti-aging research. They all have various problems at the moment. For example, rapamycin is an immunosuppressor, so it'll also make you more prone to infections. But nevertheless, they're starting points to try to see if you can develop therapeutics to slow down aging. And one of the latest ones are these GLP-1 agonists, which are very popular. We heard a couple of Bollywood panels. It's very popular among movie stars to take GLP-1 so that they can stay slim. And, but really it's meant for grossly overweight people and diabetics. But it turns out it might have a beneficial effect on aging as well. Now, I did mention that there are cells that go into a state called senescence, where they no longer divide and behave abnormally and secrete inflammatory compounds. And as we age, we accumulate these cells with the result that we have systemic inflammation. And if you find drugs that specifically kill senescent cells, that is shown to be beneficial in animals. And so that again is another strategy that's being developed eventually for use in humans. Now here's a bizarre experiment where an old rat was connected to a young rat and their circulatory systems were joined. So blood would be pumped from the old animal into the young animal and then back again. And the result of this was that the old rat benefited from the young blood of the young animal. The young rat actually suffered from the old blood of the old animal. And what this means is that as we age, our blood changes. There are factors in our blood that change. And if we can identify these factors, find out what they do, and maybe implement them for therapeutics, that's a promising approach. But of course, many people in California were not willing to wait. So all sorts of companies sprouted up, collecting blood from young donors and selling them at a huge markup to billionaires, to aging billionaires. And one of them took matters in his own hand. This is Brian Johnson, a tech billionaire. And what he decided was to keep things all in the family. He got blood transfusions from his son on the right, and in turn he gave transfusions to his dad on the left. And so this lasted a while, but he was also a data hog, and he used to measure all these aging markers, and I think he came to the conclusion that it wasn't doing much for him, and he stopped the experiment. So another aspect is metabolite loss. As we get older, there are important chemicals that we make all the time in our bodies, and we often use vitamins to make them, but we make them through our general nutrients. But as we get older, our ability to make these compounds also declines. And so there's an idea that if we supplement with some of these compounds, we might actually help with some of these processes. And one of the more trendy ones today are these NAD precursors. These levels of this compound called NAD decline by about 30 or 40% in older people. And so precursors of these compound are being sold as supplements. It's currently a $300 million a year business and predicted to be about $1 billion a year in just a few years. And one final thing I should point out, which is one of the more challenging but also one of the more exciting ideas. We know that when we start off as a single cell, a fertilized egg, that cell divides and eventually becomes an early embryonic cell complex called the blastocyst. And from there, it specializes into different kinds of stem cells. And each of these kinds of stem cells gives rise to certain types of tissue. Now, normally, it only goes in this direction. You don't see an adult going back to an egg, a fertilized egg. However, some very clever experiments by Yamanaka, who won the Nobel Prize for his work, showed that you can take some of these cells and push them backwards. In fact, you can push them all the way back to this state, this early embryonic state. But if you were able to push it even slightly backwards, then you might be able to start revitalizing or regenerating tissue. And early experiments in this direction have been extremely promising. But of course, going from experiments in mice, which are short-term experiments, to doing something that's safe and effective in humans and properly dosed, properly targeted, without risk for cancer or other long-term effects, that's still a long way off, but it is a very exciting field. And the final thing I would like to say is, while you're waiting for the big biomedical enterprise to come up with better remedies for aging, there are a lot of things you can do yourself. And in fact, probably our grandmothers told us that exercise and eating moderately and sleep was good for us. But of course, our grandmothers didn't know why. But now we know why these things are actually good for us. And it turns out they affect many of the important pathways in aging. And finally, they also act in concert. For example, if you exercise, you're likely to sleep better. If you sleep better, you're also likely not to overeat and be stressed out. And stress itself is a driver of aging. And if you do these three things, you're less likely to be stressed as well. So this is a trio that I would say is a good place to start, something that all of us could actually do. And then there are two other things that I should point out, that sociologists have found that if you are socially isolated in old age, you have a higher mortality rate. So it's important to have friends and be part of a community, even as you're getting older, and not be isolated. And people with a sense of purpose, even in old age, they have projects, they do volunteer work, they have things like that they care about and want to do. Those people tend to live longer than people without a sense of purpose. So those are two other aspects. And that we don't quite understand, because the brain and the rest of the body have very complicated linkages that we don't quite understand. And then there are three things that you should all do as soon as you reach middle age, which is check for blood pressure, cholesterol, and diabetes, because these are easily diagnosed and easily treated. So I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. That was quite brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much. Complex ideas made simple. Let's start with the various ways you said in which you could maybe deny the effects of aging, or maybe reverse them, or at least arrest them. One of them was reducing calories. Yeah? So Ozempic may be the way to live longer?
Well, Ozempic, well, certainly caloric restriction will help you.
Yeah.
But Ozempic may have effects beyond caloric restriction.
Such as?
It may have anti-inflammatory properties as well. There are even some preliminary studies having beneficial effects on the brain. The brain, aging of the brain is a big, serious problem.
Yep.
So there could be a lot of benefits to the drugs like Ozempic.
But even say tirzepatide, all of them, all the GLP inhibitors, you think?
I don't know if all of them are identical.
Okay.
So there are differences between these GLP drugs. And of course, GLP drugs also do have side effects. For example, there are things like muscle loss and other side effects. So I think giving it to somebody who's severely diabetic or severely obese, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But giving it to a healthy person, that requires a much more stringent test of safety and long-term efficacy.
So why does reducing or restricting your calories help you live longer?
Because many of the pathways that are affected by caloric restriction, it turns out are beneficial in old age, because, for example, they upregulate or turn on the recycling pathways. So the cell
So
gets...
when you say pathways, you mean neural pathways, or what are we
No,
talking about?
cellular pathways.
So explain that, because that's
So,
quite
so there are processes going on in the cell. The cell is taking your genes and using that information to make proteins. The proteins carry out their function. But as you age, the quality of the proteins declines. The proteins start misbehaving. They start clumping. And whenever you have aberrant molecules in the cell has elaborate machinery to get rid of the garbage. It has effectively a garbage recycling mechanism. And what some of these pathways do is they turn on or upregulate the garbage recycling mechanism. They also slow down making new proteins so that you don't add to the garbage. So there are complicated ways that I've discussed in the book by which caloric restriction helps. Now you might ask, why do these pathways exist if they're causing a problem? Well, it has to do with the fact that early in life they're beneficial. It's beneficial to produce lots of protein, grow fast, etc.
So basically, everybody in this audience, if they want to live longer, eating less may help.
Eating moderately, I would say, and not overeating and eating healthy food is absolutely a no-brainer.
Yeah, in some ways, though, this is counterintuitive, because if reducing calories makes you live longer, why is it in societies where there's so much hunger, people don't live longer?
That's due to other reasons. So caloric restriction doesn't mean that you have less food than you need. For example, it's in these experiments, the rats don't lose weight, they don't starve. Okay, but in a famine, or if you're in a very poor condition, you're actually getting fewer calories than you need to survive. That's not caloric restriction.
Okay, that's caloric restriction was number one. Number two was basically vampirism, right? Changing your bloodstream.
Oh yeah, that's right. So, I think just getting blood transfusions is not going to do much for you. However, there may be undoubtedly there are factors in blood that are either helping you as you age, factors in young blood that are beneficial, or there are factors in old blood that are actually harmful. And so if we can identify both types of factors, we can find out how to inhibit the bad ones and benefit from the good ones. And that's a big ongoing research field, because there are hundreds of factors in blood, and not all of them are related to aging. So you have to find out which ones are related to aging, and then see what they do, and then see if you can use
But
them.
as of now, you would not advise anyone who's young to just store lots of their blood and take it when they're older?
No,
All right,
I think it's pointless. But caloric, watching what you eat and maintaining a moderate weight is a good thing.
Okay. Then there was a third one I didn't fully understand, which was that business about getting rid of the cells that were not working or something. Explain that again, because I don't understand.
So it turns out that when cells undergo stress, for example, let's say the DNA in your cell is damaged. The body doesn't want that cell to stick around because it's a cancer risk. If you have a damaged DNA, it could mutate and become a cancerous cell. So evolution has selected for a mechanism to get rid of any cells that are stressed or damaged. And these cells die, or they go into a state called senescence. Now, why would they go into a state called senescence? Because senescent cells secrete inflammatory compounds, and our immune system then comes there, gets rid of the cells, but also repairs any damage, because the damage could be due to a virus or due to a wound or something else. And so it's a very sophisticated mechanism that helps us early in life. But as we get older, more and more of our cells are damaged and stressed. So the number of senescent cells goes up beyond our ability to clear them. And the immune system is also declining, so it's not as efficient as it used to be. And so these senescent cells accumulate. They secrete inflammatory compounds. The inflammation then is systemic, or you have high level of base level of inflammation. That in turn produces more senescent cells, because it also causes more stress. So it's a vicious cycle. And that's why if you're able to specifically target these senescent cells, you could potentially improve the situation. And that's exactly what has happened in mice. They've figured out how to target senescent cells by targeting some special characteristics of these cells and found beneficial effects. But before you can use that to humans, you have to make sure these compounds are not highly toxic over the long run. They don't cause other side effects. You know, there are all sorts of issues. And so again, it's promising, but not quite there.
So we don't have the drugs to do that, tested and working in human beings
no,
yet?
I don't think so. I don't think anybody would claim that there are drugs there, but there are drugs which are very close or in trials. And
So what, 5 years away, 10 years away?
Possibly, yeah, I would say, yeah.
So it could happen.
Yeah.
Okay. Then the other things you said were about just generally being healthy, exercise, eat well, avoid stress, etc. That I think is self-evident. Then there was an interesting thing you said, people whose minds were occupied, older people, people who weren't lonely, who were with friends, generally tended to have less of a problem in terms of. So is that to do with the state of the brain? What makes the difference?
Absolutely. Well, you know, we all know that the brain and the body have really quite remarkable, intricate connections. For example, people who are depressed are also more susceptible to infections.
Okay.
So there's a real connection between the brain and the rest of the body. What we don't know is all of the mechanisms that lead from a state of the brain to changes in the body that allow you to change your physiology. And so all we know at this point is an observation that people who tend to be more social and less lonely tend to be healthier and live longer.
So could antidepressant, mood-altering drugs, could they help?
I don't know, to be honest, but I wouldn't be surprised. My guess would be yes.
Marijuana, could that help?
Well,
Same argument.
I couldn't possibly comment.
All right, you couldn't. Okay, so we've got that now.
I can just imagine the newspaper saying, you know,
Nobel Laureate advocates drugs. Hash, he says, is the way out. The other thing that interests me is that often when people die, it's not necessarily of old age. It's because of things like cancer, etc. Are we nearer avoiding that, or do we just have to live with those consequences?
Well, there are two things. One is people have made calculations. If you eliminated the 4 horsemen of old age, as they call it, which are cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and dementias. Okay? If you eliminated all of them, you would gain about 15 years of life, not more. Okay, and that's something of a surprise.
Right? That's a lot.
No, it's not a huge amount because look, on average we live about 80 to 85, and the highest, longest living humans live to be 115. We wouldn't even get there. We'd be, you know,
But we get to 100 then. It's not so bad, right?
It's not bad. It's not bad. But there's another way of thinking about it, and the way of thinking about it is all of these diseases. If you want to ask what is the single biggest risk factor, what is your biggest risk factor for diabetes, cancer, or dementia, or heart disease? It's age. Okay? You're much more likely to get them if you're old than if you're young. And so the thinking in the aging research community is if we were to tackle the causes of aging itself, then we might also postpone or even completely avoid some of these diseases.
So there's a chicken and egg kind of thing at work here.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a chicken or egg. I would say aging may be the source. You know, in other words, as you age, other kinds of errors build up, which make you more prone to developing these other diseases.
You talked about boomers and their desire to live forever, if not forever to live longer. Now in America, as you're aware, this is a huge youth growth industry. Are any of these startups, any of these companies, any of these potential therapies, according to you, worth taking seriously?
Many of them are. You'd have to look at what the science and the technology behind is. If they're based on some of the solid biology that's come out in the last 40 years or so,
Yeah.
then yes, they're using that fundamental scientific advance to try and develop therapeutics. And I would say many, maybe hundreds of those companies are legitimate and trying to do something legitimate. But there are also a lot of charlatans.
Which is inevitable, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when you talked about cells and you said that even in death there are living cells, which is why the organs can be transplanted, donated, etc. The thing that struck me was when we talk about preventing aging, are we talking about delaying the onset of death? Or are we suggesting that, say, somebody who's 50 could be like 50 forever?
I think the goal of the aging research community would be to age healthily. So it would, what you say is as an extreme version, that somebody is 50 forever. Forever is not a concept most people would buy into, because
okay, 50 for another 30 years, shall we say?
Yeah, I think that's the goal. The goal is that we would stay healthier longer. That's to some extent already happened. For example, you know, a year ago I hiked in the Grand Canyon, I bicycled 10 miles a day. My grandparents would not, at my age, would not have been in a condition to do that. So that's already happening. But I think if you directly attacked aging, it might happen even more. And then the idea is that we might be healthy until we start hitting that natural limit, in the sort of low hundreds. And then, things would perhaps break down. But that's also not clear. If we were to remain healthy, what would cause that decline? Maybe that decline would be postponed as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's an open question.
One of the interesting things you said was we know that low birth rates in Europe, perhaps Japan, then many countries, there isn't a replacement rate. And we've always...
Including most parts of India, I should say.
Yeah, I was about to say that. And we always imagined that India was an exception to this, because we've been brought up to think of a population problem, an expanding population. Now you're saying, actually, this is not true of South India, for instance, and there are 4 states.
Five.
That's
Five states.
Which are the 5?
I don't quite remember. I think, they were all in the
north.
But
like the usual suspects, Bihar, UP, all right.
Madhya Pradesh.
Yeah.
And
so
I forgot what the other two
why?
were.
Why do you think those are different? Is it to do with education, lifestyle?
I think, well, if you look at demographics historically, people have improved economics and education before birth rates fell.
Yeah.
Okay? It's not that birth rates fall and then the economy improves. Rather, it's a consequence. And so I think, if the economy of these states improves, then they will inevitably follow the demographic trend. And a lot of that also has to do with empowerment of women. I mean, when women get educated and become economically independent, they're, shall we say, less reluctant to simply be vessels for popping out children, okay? So it's quite natural.
It makes a difference. So is it fair as a generalization to say, on the whole, rich people live longer?
It's absolutely true, and it's even true in a country like Britain, which has a national health service, so that, for example, the director of my institute gets essentially the same medical care as the cleaner in the building. Okay? And even in Britain, the richest 10% live about 10 years more than the poorest 10%. In the US, it's about 15 years. But the point is, it's actually worse than that. If you look at healthy years, the difference is almost double. So instead of 10 years, it's 20 years is the difference in healthy lives. And in the US, it might be close to 30 years.
So as economic standards and educational standards improve around the world, are we looking at a situation where the global population stops growing and doesn't really make that much difference because people live longer?
It could happen. Of course, Africa is the huge exception. India is no longer the exception. But there are other parts. I think parts of the Middle East are still growing rapidly. Africa is growing rapidly. And so
but China is not, right?
Sorry?
China is not.
China is not. And in fact, China is now worried because they had this one-child policy and their population is declining. And now they're encouraging people to have more children, but it's not working, because they're well off economically, and of course they don't want to have more children. And so I think you could face a world where you have an increasingly older population and with a very slow replacement rate. And that's going to create a different kind of society. And in my view, it may create a more stagnant and less dynamic society. India, for some time at least, has a demographic dividend. Although the birth rate is falling, it still has a relatively young population. But it has about a generation to make use of that young population.
But is it fair to say that people in this audience below the age of, say, 40 will live probably longer on average than their parents? But even as they live longer, it won't help because oldies like you and me will still be around?
I think oldies, probably if they're 40, I'm 70. I don't think I'll be around when they're...
But that was going to be my last question. You are 70, but you look 50. So what's the secret?
Well, thank you for saying so, but when I look at the mirror, and especially if I look at the back of my head, I don't see that I look.
But is it exercise and diet in your case?
Well, I don't. I eat moderately, and the one thing I do is regular exercise.
Okay.
And I do that almost by force because I don't own a car, and Cambridge is very convenient to bicycle around in, and so. That keeps me relatively healthy, I suppose.
And, and periodically you cycle through the Grand Canyon?
No, I hike. I go hiking. But I should say my father used to walk until he was about 93 or 94. He would walk about 12 kilometers a day and also carry heavy groceries on his bag. And he died a few months ago when he was almost 99. So I think lifestyle does matter. But there is a genetic component as well.
As well, right?
Yeah.
Well, fascinating. I think you've taken a very complicated subject, a subject that involves all of us, and you made it explicable to us by explaining it so lucidly. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has certainly been a session where we have come away more educated and informed. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramakrishnan, as well as Mr. Sanghvi. May I please invite on stage Dhruba Mukherjee, Director, ABP Network, and Abhijit Kumar, General Manager, Adani Group, to join us on stage and present Dr. Ramakrishnan with a memento. Thank you so much, Mr. Sanghvi, and once again, thank you, Dr. Ramakrishnan. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had 2 days of wonderful conversations, and there is one grand finale that still awaits us. And this is going to be a session you will not forget. It features India's sporting legends, and we can't wait to hear their stories. And of course, that's coming up very, very shortly. But before that, I'm going to request